He learned early that money changed the way people looked at you. As a child, he noticed it in small ways. The way adults listened more closely when his father spoke. The way problems disappeared after a phone call. The way doors opened without explanations. Wealth didn't arrive suddenly. It grew, quietly. And with it came power. By the time he was an adult, he no longer questioned it. Money wasn't just security, it was identity. He built his life around efficiency, around control, around certainty. Emotions to him were variables, unpredictable, unreliable. Success felt safer. He rose quickly, not because he was reckless, but because he was precise. He knew how to negotiate, how to dominate a room without raising his voice, how to make people feel replaceable, and people admired that. They called him disciplined, focused, brilliant. From the outside, he looked like a man who had mastered life. Inside, something else was happening. His days were full, meetings, deals, numbers, decisions. But his nights were empty. He lived in a house that felt more like a monument than a home. High ceilings, cold lighting, furniture chosen for status, not comfort. Silence followed him everywhere. At first, he enjoyed it. Silence meant no demands, no vulnerability, no one asking for parts of him he didn't want to give. Relationships came and went easily. People were drawn to him, to his power, to the life he represented. But intimacy never lasted. He didn't know how to share space without controlling it. He didn't know how to listen without calculating. He didn't know how to love without setting terms. Romantic partners often described him the same way. Attentive at first, charming, protective, then distant, then cold, not cruel, just unavailable. He paid for everything, trips, comfort, silence, and somewhere along the way, he confused access with affection. If someone stayed, it meant loyalty. If they left, it meant weakness. He never questioned whether people stayed because they loved him or because leaving meant losing everything he provided. Money made that question unnecessary, or so he thought. As the years passed, his circle shrank. Not dramatically, gradually. Friends became contacts. Conversations became transactions. Trust became a liability. He noticed that people rarely disagreed with him, rarely challenged him, rarely said no. At first, it felt like respect. Later, it felt like something else, but he didn't name it. He told himself this was the cost of being at the top. That loneliness was a tax paid by powerful men. That comfort required distance. He believed it. Until one night proved otherwise. He came home later than usual. The house was dark. He stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by luxury that felt strangely unfamiliar. There was no one to tell about his day. No one waiting. No one who knew his moods without being paid to manage them. He realized something unsettling. No one missed him. Not truly. They depended on him, respected him, feared losing him, but they didn't miss him. That distinction settled slowly in his chest, and for the first time, the silence felt heavy. He began to notice patterns he had ignored for years. People never interrupted him. They laughed at jokes that weren't funny. They agreed before he finished speaking. At first, it fed his ego. Then it numbed him. He realized conversations no longer surprised him. Nothing challenged him. Nothing moved him. Even disagreements felt rehearsed, carefully measured, safe. He could feel when someone was holding back, when they were choosing words instead of speaking truth. And he understood why. Saying the wrong thing around him had consequences. Not immediate, not violent, but real. Opportunities disappeared. Access closed. Invitations stopped coming. He never announced punishment. He simply withdrew, and people learned. This made him powerful, but it also made him untouchable. Intimacy requires risk, and no one risked anything around him. Romantic relationships followed the same pattern. In the beginning, everything felt intense. New partners were fascinated by his confidence, by the ease with which he moved through the world, by the security he represented. They felt chosen. He enjoyed this phase, the admiration, the way people leaned toward him when he spoke. But admiration faded quickly. Once the novelty disappeared, expectations emerged. Needs, emotions. That was where things broke. He didn't know how to respond to vulnerability without trying to manage it. He offered solutions instead of presence, money instead of time, structure instead of warmth. If someone felt insecure, he compensated financially. If someone wanted closeness, he offered stability. He believed this was love. He didn't understand why it never lasted. Partners often described a similar sensation, that being with him felt safe, but lonely, that he was always there, but never fully present, that everything revolved around his rhythm, his needs, his comfort. They said he listened, but didn't hear, that he cared, but only on his terms. He dismissed these observations. To him, emotions were negotiable, adjustable. He expected gratitude for everything he provided, and when gratitude turned into resentment, he felt betrayed. He began to believe people were ungrateful by nature. That loyalty was rare. That attachment was a weakness. So he protected himself the only way he knew how. By controlling distance, he kept relationships close enough to serve him, but far enough not to demand anything he couldn't calculate. Over time, people stopped asking for more. They adapted. They accepted the version of him that existed. Or they disappeared. He barely noticed when they did. His calendar remained full. His phone never stopped ringing. But something was missing. He began to feel irritated by small things. Unexplained frustration. A constant sense of impatience. Silence no longer felt like peace. It felt like emptiness. At night, he sat alone in rooms designed to impress guests who were no longer there. Surrounded by objects that symbolized achievement, not belonging. Everything he owned looked perfect and meant nothing. He realized that no one ever asked how he was doing, not genuinely. They asked about results, about outcomes, about numbers. He had trained them to do that. He had taught people that his value lived in what he produced, not in who he was. And now, that was all they saw. There was a moment, quiet, insignificant on the surface, that began to fracture him. He was sick. Not seriously, just enough to slow him down. For the first time in years, he canceled meetings, missed events, stopped responding immediately, and no one noticed. Messages kept coming. Requests kept piling up. But no one asked if he needed anything. No one checked on him. He realized then that his absence didn't create concern. it created inconvenience. That understanding settled deep inside him. He wasn't essential. He was functional, replaceable the moment he stopped delivering. The power he had built didn't protect him. It isolated him. And for the first time, he felt something he couldn't buy his way out of. Fear. Not of losing money. Not of losing status. Fear of being completely alone. And realizing he had helped build that solitude himself. He tried to change. Not dramatically. Not publicly. Quietly. He started inviting people without agendas. Dinners with no business attached. Conversations without outcomes. It felt unnatural. He didn't know how to be present without steering the direction. Silence made him uncomfortable now, not because it was empty, but because it exposed him. When people spoke, he waited for something useful, a purpose, a result, and when none came, he felt lost. He realized he had spent years training himself to extract value from every interaction. Efficiency had replaced curiosity. Control had replaced connection. He tried dating again. This time, he told himself he would do things differently. He would listen more, interrupt less, give space, but habits don't dissolve just because we want them to. When she spoke about her fears, he offered solutions. When she wanted reassurance, he gave structure. When she asked for closeness, he proposed plans. She told him once, gently, that she didn't need to be fixed. She needed to be felt. He didn't understand what that meant. He thought presence was proximity, that providing meant caring. She tried to explain, but the words never reached him fully. They slid off the armor he had built over decades. Eventually, she grew quiet. That silence felt familiar to him. Too familiar. He noticed that people around him became smaller, less expressive, less demanding. They adapted to his limits, and adaptation looked a lot like agreement. The more he tried to loosen control, the more anxious he became. Uncertainty felt dangerous. Emotion felt inefficient. He caught himself wanting to retreat, to reassert authority, to restore order. That frightened him because it meant the problem wasn't other people. It was him. He began to reflect on his past relationships, on the people who had left quietly, on the friendships that faded without conflict. They hadn't been dramatic endings. They had been slow withdrawals. People didn't fight him. They surrendered and walked away emotionally long before they left physically. That realization hurt more than rejection. It meant he had never truly been challenged, never been forced to confront himself. Money had protected him from consequences, from feedback, from discomfort, and without those, growth never happened. He noticed that even when he tried to be vulnerable, it felt performative, calculated. He didn't know how to speak without control, how to admit confusion without turning it into a strategy. He was fluent in confidence, illiterate in intimacy. The loneliness deepened, not because people weren't around, but because no one could reach him. He stood one night in front of the mirror longer than usual, not examining his appearance, but searching for something familiar. The man looking back at him was composed, successful, untouchable, and completely disconnected. He wondered when he had last felt genuinely understood, not admired, not respected. Understood. The answer terrified him. He couldn't remember. For the first time, he questioned the life he had built, not its success, but its meaning, and meaning was not something he knew how to acquire. He had mastered accumulation, not connection. That night, he didn't sleep. He lay awake, surrounded by luxury that felt increasingly irrelevant, wondering if it was already too late to learn how to be human again. He returned to what had always worked: money. When discomfort grew, he spent. When loneliness pressed in, he compensated. He upgraded houses he barely lived in, bought cars he drove alone, surrounded himself with symbols meant to reassure him that nothing was wrong. Luxury had always been his language, his proof, his armor. But something had changed. The satisfaction didn't last anymore. The excitement faded faster. The silence returned heavier. He began to notice how transactional his world had become. Every interaction carried an expectation. Every gesture implied a return. He paid for attention without realizing it. Dinners, trips, access. People showed up, smiled, stayed, but they never settled. They never relaxed around him, never spoke freely, never disagreed. The more he gave, the more distant they felt. He tried to convince himself that this was enough, that companionship didn't need depth, that comfort was a fair substitute for intimacy. But the body doesn't lie. He began waking up with a tight chest, breathing shallow, irritable for no reason he could name. He grew impatient with people who needed reassurance, annoyed by emotion, uncomfortable with pauses. Anything unstructured felt like a threat. He noticed how quickly he wanted to escape moments of vulnerability, how silence now exposed something he didn't want to face: himself. There were nights he sat alone, scrolling through messages that meant nothing, replies that arrived instantly, conversations that never went anywhere. No one asked questions that mattered. No one stayed long enough to listen to the answer. He began to feel invisible in a way he had never experienced before, not ignored, unseen, and that distinction cut deep. He tried to be generous in different ways: charity events, donations, public gestures. People praised him, admired him even more, but admiration did nothing for the emptiness. It amplified it. Because applause fades quickly when you go home alone, he realized that people didn't feel closer to him when he gave. They felt smaller. Gratitude created distance. Dependence replaced equality. He began to understand something uncomfortable. Money created imbalance in every relationship he had. It elevated him and diminished everyone else, and connection cannot survive imbalance. He tried to talk about this once, carefully, indirectly. He mentioned feeling disconnected, empty. The response was polite, sympathetic, brief. Then the conversation moved on. No one knew how to sit with him in that space, and he had never taught them how. He had spent a lifetime rewarding performance and punishing vulnerability. Now, no one dared to show him anything real. He had become the safest person to impress and the most dangerous person to be honest with. That realization didn't bring clarity. It brought grief. Grief for something he never learned to build. He started to understand that money had solved every problem except the one he now faced. It couldn't make someone stay for him. It couldn't make someone see him. It couldn't make someone love him. For the first time, wealth felt insufficient. And insufficiency terrified him, because it meant there was a part of life he had no leverage over, no control. no purchase. And standing in that helplessness, he felt smaller than he ever had at the bottom. Something in him began to fracture. Not loudly, not visibly. It happened in small shifts of thought, in suspicion where there had once been certainty, in distance where there had once been control. He started questioning every interaction. Why was this person here? What did they want? What would happen if he stopped providing? These questions followed him everywhere. He realized that trust, for him, had never been mutual. It had been transactional. People trusted him because he paid, because he protected access, because he controlled outcomes. But he'd never trusted anyone without leverage. That realization unsettled him deeply. He began to feel watched, even when alone, not by cameras or people, by expectations. Everyone expected something from him, and he expected betrayal in return. This created a quiet paranoia. He replayed conversations in his mind, searching for hidden motives. He analyzed tone, timing, silences. Affection began to feel suspicious. Kindness felt strategic. If someone was warm, he wondered what they needed. If someone pulled away, he assumed resentment. Nothing felt neutral anymore. This mental state exhausted him. He noticed his patience thinning, his tolerance for uncertainty shrinking. Any situation he couldn't control triggered irritation. Any emotional ambiguity felt dangerous. He began isolating himself further, not out of arrogance, but out of self-preservation. Distance felt safer than disappointment. He told himself he preferred solitude, that independence was strength, but the truth was harder. He was afraid that without money, there was nothing left that justified his presence. Afraid that if someone saw him clearly, they would leave. He had built a life where value was measured in output, and now he didn't know how to exist without producing something. Rest made him anxious. Stillness felt like exposure. He filled his time compulsively, meetings, travel, projects, anything to avoid the quiet moments when the emptiness became undeniable. He began to lose interest in things that once excited him. Deals felt repetitive. Wins felt hollow. Success no longer validated him. Instead, it reminded him of what it had cost. He thought often about people from his past, those who had walked away without drama, without demands. He wondered if they had seen something he hadn't, if they had understood earlier that proximity to him meant disappearance. This thought brought an unfamiliar emotion, regret. Not regret for mistakes made in business, but regret for moments never lived, conversations never had, vulnerability never allowed. He realized that power had not only isolated him, it had reshaped him. It had taught him to dominate rather than relate, to acquire rather than connect, to control rather than trust. And now, when he finally wanted connection, he didn't know how to receive it. Love requires surrender. And surrender felt like annihilation to him. He had spent a lifetime ensuring nothing could touch him. Now, nothing could reach him. That understanding broke something fundamental. For the first time, he didn't feel powerful. He felt trapped inside the very system he had built. And there was no exit strategy for this kind of collapse. No acquisition, no negotiation, no escape clause. Only the slow realization that wealth had not corrupted him suddenly. It had done something worse. It had trained him, patiently and thoroughly, to live without love, he began to lose the one thing that had always defined him: certainty. Decisions that once felt instinctive now felt heavy. Confidence gave way to hesitation. Authority started to feel performative. He noticed it first in small moments: meetings where he spoke less, rooms where he no longer commanded attention automatically, situations where silence followed his words instead of agreement. People hadn't changed. He had. Power had always been effortless to him. Now it felt fragile. He realized that without dominance, he didn't know how to exist in a room. Without leverage, he didn't know what he offered. This terrified him, because everything he was, everything he had become, depended on that position. He started questioning his own motives. Did he pursue success because he loved it, or because it kept people at a distance he could control? Did he build empires because he wanted to create, or because being needed felt safer than being known? These questions had no answers, only discomfort. He noticed how quickly he wanted to reassert control when he felt exposed, how his instinct was still to dominate, not connect. Even self-reflection became strategic, another problem to solve, another weakness to manage. But this time, nothing responded. There was no fix for emptiness, no metric for meaning, no transaction for belonging. He felt increasingly disconnected from his own emotions, not numb, restless, as if something inside him wanted to surface, but didn't know how. He realized he had never learned the language of vulnerability. He had skipped that stage of development entirely. Power had replaced it. Now, stripped of its comfort, he felt emotionally illiterate. He tried therapy, not because he believed in it, but because he had run out of options. The sessions were polite, structured, surface level. He spoke in abstractions, achievements, philosophies. He avoided specifics, avoided emotion. When asked how he felt, he described outcomes instead. The therapist waited. Silence filled the room. That silence felt unbearable. He filled it with explanations, justifications, intellectual distance. He realized then that he didn't know how to say, "I'm lonely," without turning it into a concept. Loneliness to him was not an emotion. It was a failure, and failure was unacceptable. He stopped going, not because it didn't work, but because it was working too well. It forced him into a space without power, without hierarchy, a space where money meant nothing. That space terrified him. At home, the nights grew longer. He wandered through rooms like a stranger, touching objects that symbolized achievement, but offered no comfort. Awards, art, architecture, none of it responded. He realized that everything around him was designed to impress someone who wasn't there. There was no warmth in the design, no softness, no invitation to stay. His life had been optimized for admiration, not intimacy, and now admiration had no one to impress. He stood one night by the window, city lights stretching endlessly below him. So many lives, so many stories, and none of them intersected with his. He felt small in a way he had never allowed himself to feel before. Not humble, exposed. For the first time, he admitted something he had spent decades avoiding. He didn't know who he was without power, and he didn't know how to become someone else. That realization didn't come with resolution. It came with a quiet, suffocating grief. The grief of understanding that some losses don't happen suddenly. they happen slowly, while you're winning. The collapse didn't arrive as a disaster. There was no scandal, no financial loss, no public humiliation. From the outside, nothing changed. And that was the most brutal part. His life continued to function perfectly. Businesses ran. Accounts grew. His name still carried weight. But inside, something had shut down. He stopped feeling anticipation, stopped feeling pride, stopped feeling urgency. Success no longer pulled him forward. It only reminded him of what he had sacrificed. He began to withdraw, not strategically, but emotionally. He answered messages late, canceled invitations without explanation, avoided gatherings where admiration felt hollow. People assumed he was busy, important, untouchable. They didn't see the truth. He was tired of being impressive, tired of being needed, tired of being untouchable. He noticed how uncomfortable people became when he was quiet, how they rushed to fill silence with praise or reassurance. They didn't know how to be with him without performing, and he had taught them that. He remembered moments from his past with painful clarity. Times when someone had tried to get close. Times when someone had asked for more than he was willing to give. He had labeled them demanding, emotional, unprofessional. Now he saw something else. They had been asking him to be human, and he had refused. He realized that power hadn't simply corrupted him. It had insulated him, protected him from feedback, from intimacy, from discomfort. It had allowed him to live without being challenged. And without challenge, nothing grows. He began to accept that his loneliness wasn't accidental. It was engineered. Every choice had reinforced it. Every withdrawal had strengthened it. He had built a world where he was central and unreachable. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with resignation. Because understanding arrived too late to undo decades of conditioning. He tried one last time to let someone see him. Not through money, not through power, through honesty. He admitted feeling empty, disconnected, afraid. The response was kind, sympathetic, and distant. People didn't know how to hold him in that space. They had never been allowed to. He saw it in their eyes, the uncertainty, the hesitation. They didn't trust his vulnerability. They wondered what he wanted in return. And that broke something final inside him, because it meant even when he stopped controlling, the damage remained. Trust doesn't appear on command. It grows in environments he had never created. He understood then that some consequences don't punish you loudly. They deprive you quietly. They leave you surrounded by everything and connected to nothing. He didn't rage against this truth, didn't dramatize it. He simply accepted it. Acceptance didn't bring peace, but it brought clarity. He stopped trying to fill the emptiness, stopped pretending it would go away. Instead, he learned to sit with it. That was the final cost. Not the loss of wealth, not the loss of power, but the realization that the life he had built was not one where love could survive, and that no amount of success could compensate for that absence. He didn't lose everything. That was the cruel irony. His wealth remained intact. His influence survived. His name continued to open doors. From the outside, his life still looked enviable, and yet nothing inside him responded anymore. He woke up every morning with the same awareness. there was nothing he was moving toward. No longing, no connection, no one waiting. The future felt flat, not frightening, empty. He began to understand that his life had reached a strange conclusion, not an ending, a plateau. There would be no dramatic downfall, no redemption arc, no late transformation that fixed everything, just continuity. Days repeating themselves in rooms designed for admiration, not presence. Conversations circling outcomes, never meaning. People orbiting him without ever touching him. He had become a monument to success, untouchable, uninhabited, and monuments don't feel. He stopped expecting love, not because he no longer wanted it, but because he finally understood why it never stayed. Love requires risk, equality, the willingness to be seen without armor. And he had spent a lifetime ensuring none of that was possible. Power had not destroyed his ability to love suddenly. It had trained it out of him patiently, one decision at a time, one withdrawal at a time, one controlled interaction after another. By the time he noticed what was missing, he no longer knew how to create it. That knowledge didn't make him bitter. It made him quiet. He learned to live with the absence the way others live with noise. Always there, always humming beneath everything. Sometimes, late at night, he wondered who he might have been if success hadn't rewarded his distance, if power hadn't mistaken silence for strength, if money hadn't softened every consequence. But those questions had nowhere to go. Regret doesn't rebuild what was never allowed to grow. He continued living, not unhappily, but untouched. And that was the true cost. Not what he lost, but what he never learned how to keep. Because in the end, the greatest luxury wasn't what he owned. It was what he could no longer feel.